What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking the must-know auction draft strategies so you can dominate your 2023 auction draft. So make sure to tune in. If you enjoy, hit that like button, subscribe, give us a follow on Twitter at AllDayPigskin to continue interacting with us there. Let us hear it in the comment section. Do you agree, disagree? Any other questions you guys might have, especially if they're auction draft related, we'll do our best to answer them all. But with that being said, let's get into it. Before getting into our breakdown, I want to highlight the sponsor of today's video, OddsJam. OddsJam continues to be the place that I use for all of my sports betting research, from the NFL, NBA, MLB, to daily fantasy and everything in between. But don't just take my word for it. Let me show you firsthand all the amazing tools OddsJam has to offer. Starting with their positive EV tool, which identifies situations where a single sportsbook has mispriced their line compared to the rest of the market. They're basically willing to pay a lot more so that you bet with them compared to the other sportsbook. At the end of the day, you're getting the best odds, essentially a mathematical edge and guaranteed money in the long run. But also available is OddsJam's arbitrage tool, which shows situations where the market is so mispriced that you can bet on both sides and guarantee a risk-free return. OddsJam's calculators show you exactly how much you have to bet on the over and under and what the respective guaranteed risk-free return would be. There's also OddsJam's Sportsbook tool, which consolidates all available market info, over 200 sportsbooks, and provides updates in real time and allows you to see line movement. But my personal favorite is their Fantasy Optimizer tool, which is great for those using PrizePicks, Underdogs, or other daily fantasy sites, as you get to see discrepancies between all of these sportsbooks. Imagine PrizePicks has a Patrick Mahomes line at 200.5 passing yards, and all other books like FanDuel and Underdog have this line at 230 passing yards. Well, getting the over 200.5 on PrizePicks would be an absolute steal. Guess what? OddsJam does that for you. And the good news is, if you sign up today and use our code PIGSKIN, check the link and promo code in the description of this video, you will get 25% off your first month. OddsJam also has a 7-day free trial, so you get to try before you buy. So don't waste any more time and sign up for OddsJam using our code PIGSKIN today. Now, for this breakdown, as you can see, I've pulled up a sample ESPN auction draft. I'll have it kind of going in the background. I figured it would be somewhat useful for us to track what's going on, to see this thing play out as we are discussing some of these must-know strategies. But with that out of the way, let's start with, in my opinion, the most important thing, and that is when it is your turn to nominate early on, nominate players that you do not want to draft, and preferably guys that are expensive. So the example here would be, maybe you are worried about somebody like a Davante Adams because of the Jimmy Garoppolo quarterback situation in Las Vegas. Okay, makes sense. He's somebody that's expected to go for over $50, and you don't want him on your team whatsoever. There's always going to be at least one big-time player, the equivalent of a first-round selection that you are okay staying away from, and you don't really want to target. So that's what you want to do here. You want to identify those guys, and you want to force your league mates to spend their money, and especially a big chunk of money early on these guys that you are perfectly fine not having on your roster for one reason or another, whether you're concerned about injuries, whether, it's a situation that they're on a new team, there's competition behind them, things of that nature. Guys you don't want to touch, you are perfectly fine avoiding. Force somebody else to draft them. That way, later on in the draft, if it's between you and that said individual, for a player that you actually do want, you have a much better chance of landing said player because you can control the bidding process. And, kind of spoiler alert, but the name of the game for these auction drafts is controlling the bidding process, managing your funds. But I'm going to get into that a little bit later. While we are on the topic of what players, you should nominate, let's also talk about the players that you should not nominate. Now, I see this a lot of times in auction drafts as well, with individuals nominating sleepers, guys that are going, if it were a snake draft, like in the 6th, 7th, 8th round, later on, but they're being nominated early on in the auction draft process because that individual was really high on them and they want to go ahead and draft them now and get it out of the way. But hear me out. I have done enough of these auction drafts where I know I have seen it over and over and over. The time when somebody is most willing to spend money will be the time when they have that money to spend. So, more than likely, you are just going to burn yourself. If it's somebody that you are absolutely in love with, somebody that is a must-own player for you, guess what? There's a good chance that somebody else also feels like that. But you can game the system a little bit if you wait a little bit longer as the draft progresses, 20, 30, 40 picks afterwards since the start, and then that player is nominated, especially if you have a good chunk of change still left, if you've been smart about managing your funds. Because what typically happens in auction drafts is as the draft progresses, that's when the values start to appear. For example, you always see kind of a projected price for every single player. Here, we're happening to be doing this on ESPN. So to the left over here of their draft profile is the nomination suggested amount, the average cost. As the draft progresses, I promise you, there will not be as many overpays as there are when the draft begins. That is just the nature of the auction draft. People become a little bit more cautious, and typically they're a little bit handcuffed by the maximum amount of money they can offer. And speaking of the maximum amount of money you can offer, just remember that it's, you start out with, let's say, $200, but you have to fill out 15 roster spots typically. So the max amount of money that you're going to be able to offer isn't actually the money you have left. It's the money you have minus, the number of empty roster spots that you have. I feel like it's, something that people get a little bit confused about sometimes, but it's just a little neat mathematical trick to keep in mind, because we're going to be talking here, big picture stuff. We're going to be talking minute stuff. I want this to be the, the big time breakdown of auction drafts, everything you could possibly want, all, from the biggest things to the smallest things, everything you could want here. But let's continue to move on. Now, we've talked what players to nominate, what players not to nominate. Let's talk about going into your auction drafts, how to prepare. So first and foremost, I will say this. If you have an upcoming auction draft on Yahoo, then please, please, please do your mock auction drafts on the exact same platform that you will be participating for your league. Because just as an example, if Derrick Henry here, who's up for nomination, the projected price is $57 on ESPN, that does not mean that's going to be the exact same price on Yahoo or NFL or any other platform. The takeaway message being that just because you can put together one roster on, let's say, ESPN, does not mean you are going to be able to do the exact same thing on Yahoo. Because, it's a little bit easier to do if it was a snake draft, but with these auction drafts, you have so much more to take into account. It's bidding behavior, it's how much money is left. It's a lot more, psychology involved in it. So just keep that in mind. But let's talk about the actual strategies. I say this all the time when I'm talking snake drafts. With snake drafts, the best approach is to let the draft come to you. That's typically the best approach. And, just go best player available, something of that nature. And usually it will work out for you. Now, in auction drafts, to me, it really is the opposite. With an auction draft, you have to go into the draft knowing what you want to do. Because the reason being, in auction drafts, theoretically, you can put together your ultimate roster. It just depends how much you are willing to pay. But with auction drafts, it's tough to start out with, an aggressive mindset, then flip-flop to maybe being conservative, then aggressive again, then balanced. You have to go into it saying, I'm going to either be, aggressive, I'm going to be conservative, or I'm going to be balanced. And again, the reason for that is because it is almost impossible to flip-flop in between those. The amount of money you spend early on is going to dictate what strategy you have to go after. Go sit down, do a quick exercise with the guys that you are targeting, plus minus a couple of extra dollars. See how much money you have left over at the end of the day when you select those guys on paper. Now, I mentioned 3 different strategies. The 3 different strategies I mentioned are conservative, balanced, and aggressive. Let's start with the conservative strategy. So with the conservative strategy, the way I like to think about this, as the name suggests, you are a little bit more frugal with the money you have early on. And in this case, you wait for the big bids to kind of get out the way. You wait for people to spend up their majority of money so that later on you can get a bunch of steals, you can get a bunch of depth, and you can dominate the nomination and bidding process. So what's typical in a conservative type of auction draft strategy is that you might not necessarily have a top tier guy. So if it's a snake draft, the way I like to think about it is you might not have a first round type of talent, but you might have multiple late second round type of guys or multiple early third round types of names. So that's how I approach that situation. Now let's look at the other extreme. Let's think about it if you are ultra aggressive. So like I said before, if you want, that's the beauty of the auction draft. You can draft Christian McCaffrey and Justin Jefferson, something that you could never do in a typical redraft league. But if you want to do it, you can do that in an auction draft. The problem is, afterwards, you're probably going to be left with about $50 to play with to fill out the remaining 13 or how many ever roster spots you might have. So you're going to be extremely handicapped, and the rest of the roster is going to be big time in terms of drop-offs from expected points scored, talent, things like that. Now, what's typical in the aggressive strategies? Sure, you have 2 alpha guys. So again, think about it, 2 early first round selections, but then you have 0 depth pretty much on your bench. And the thing that I don't like with the aggressive strategy is that, God forbid, that one of the guys that you really like is injured and then you spent a lot of money on, you're almost done for. You have to really, really do a great job on the waiver wire. But yeah, that becomes a very, very tough situation in that case. So then the balance strategy, the one that's still left, obviously is the one that's kind of somewhere in between. Basically, you treat it as if it's a snake draft. So you land a guy that's a first round selection, a guy that's a second round, third round, fourth round, so on and so forth. This type of roster, I would say, is kind of the easiest to construct, and it typically has a good result in it. You're going to be a competitive team. You're going to have some depth on the bench. You're not going to have maybe as many studs as top heavy of a team, but the drop off from guy to guy won't be as large, and that also is valuable as well. What I typically tell beginners in auction drafts is try to have somewhat of a balanced approach. Now, me personally, somebody that has a lot of years experience with the auction draft process, I look at this every single year. I try and do new strategies, updated strategies for the auction draft process. What I've come to learn and realize, I have the best result when I go somewhere between balanced and aggressive. The reason being is because typically, you need at least one stud on your team to kind of carry you. You need at least one big time guy. But then also later on, being able to control the bidding process, being smart with your money allows you to still get some steals, still have a decent bench as well, and really be a contender. So those are the three different ways that you can approach the situation. And again, you want to go in with a set strategy because flip-flopping between the three typically leads to disaster. And that's the number one way to end up being unhappy with your auction drafts. Now, also, when we're talking players, another thing I want you to be aware of is knowing your player tiers. Because with the auction draft process, it happens in snake drafts too, but knowing when there's a tier break, because you're going to get to that situation where all of a sudden there's a big break from RB1s to RB2s, and you're going to see people start bidding up that last one great RB1, for example. You don't want to be in that situation where you have to land that one guy, so you have to massively overpay. You want to be able to kind of track that. Get in on the bidding process for a guy that you like before the bottom is about to drop off. That's why tracking the tiers is so important. But now let's kind of talk about the final point here, and that is managing your funds. I said at the beginning of the breakdown, the auction draft process, the name of the game is knowing how to handle your money. Kind of everything is tied to this. And, I kind of have a couple of final points to mention here. First and foremost, bidding wars. So with bidding wars, there's a lot of things that can lead to bidding wars. Again, you have to see what different players are doing, what positions they still need, if there's going to be a tier break, something like that. All those things can lead to bidding wars. Now, I'm not going to say don't get into any single bidding wars because they're naturally going to happen. Chances are there's going to be at least one other league mate that also likes the same player that you do. So in every single year as well, there are guys that are underpriced and overpriced. Typically, if you're drafting with savvy individuals, they're going to be able to identify the underpriced guys, and the bid is going to get a little bit higher. So what I always say with this, just be smart in the bidding wars that you do get into, and don't do it too often. Because if you do so, that's the quickest way to burn through your funds. And a lot of times it could be people just inflating the price. Now, when I say be careful with getting in a bidding war, I approve spending like $4 or $5 more than the price that's projected. And if it's somebody that's underpriced, then, even a little bit more so. But if we get to double-digit dollar amounts, that's when I typically bow out and I say, okay, I'm fine going a different direction. That's why it's so important to have a plan B, a plan C, and a plan D. Now, let's talk about one of the last points here with the auction draft process, and that is at the end of the auction draft, please, your goal should be to be as close to the $0 amount as possible. Because if you are, what that means is that you maximized, getting the highest value guys, and you didn't burn any money. Because if you finish an auction draft and you have, let's say, I would say it's almost very difficult to do this, but over $10 left, that could be the difference between you having drafted an RB2 type of talent versus you having drafted an RB1. And that is a huge difference. You are never going to get that money back that you didn't spend in your auction drafts when it's all said and done. So the goal should be to get as close to zero as possible. What I typically say is if you are under the $4 amount, that is the best situation. That's what I always shoot for. So, knowing what positions to spend up for, understanding the positional hierarchy. This is a good example. A quarterback being nominated early. Do not be the person that spends $30+ on a Patrick Mahomes. Instead, let's look at some of the other quarterbacks that are available here. Instead, wait for a $6 Trevor Lawrence. Trust me, when it gets to the guys like Justin Herbert, Justin Fields, they're not going to go for the max dollar amount. So there's a couple of positions, tight end, quarterback, where it is smart to wait for those. For running it back and wide receiver, it's a little bit different. You have to get involved earlier on. But honestly, that is the main encompassing picture here. Again, kind of just recapping it, if we had to break it down, knowing these auction draft strategies, how to be successful. First, knowing who to nominate, what players to nominate, and what players not to nominate. Next, understanding what strategy you want to go with. Do you want to be balanced, conservative, or aggressive? Afterwards, keeping up with the tier breaks in players. Also, knowing that some players you have to, just be a little bit more patient with, like quarterbacks and tight ends, things like that. And then finally, managing your funds. That's the final point. That's one of the most important points. Everything is tied back to this. Things like bidding wars, things like your final leftover money amount, everything that could be tied into this. So that is the last point here. If you guys have any other questions, let me know. Something that I might not have covered, I will be glad to go ahead and dive back into it in the comments section. If you enjoyed, hit that like button, subscribe, give us a follow on Twitter at AllDayPigskin to continue interacting with us there. But in the meantime, we'll see you guys in future videos.